What if the most predictable NBA game on the schedule is actually the one hiding the biggest strategic warning sign in the Eastern Conference? Because when you look at the upcoming clash between the Detroit Pistons and the Brooklyn Nets on March 8th, most analysts are treating it like a routine matchup, a contender facing a struggling roster, a top team protecting home court against a franchise stuck in a losing spiral. But that surface-level narrative ignores the real story brewing underneath this game. Detroit isn't just trying to win another regular season game, they're quietly trying to prove something much bigger, that this rebuild has officially crossed the line from hopeful project to legitimate Eastern Conference power. And the Nets? They're not simply losing games, they're showing structural cracks that go far beyond the scoreboard. Let's start with the raw reality. Detroit enters this matchup with one of the best records in the East, dominating statistically in almost every category that matters. They're averaging over 117 points per game while holding opponents to roughly 109, and they're controlling the glass with nearly 46 rebounds per night. Meanwhile, Brooklyn is struggling to keep pace offensively, averaging about 107 points while giving up more than 115 per game. That gap alone explains why betting markets heavily favor Detroit. But numbers never tell the whole story, because if you watch Detroit closely, you'll notice something fascinating happening inside that locker room. This team has completely redefined its identity in just 2 seasons. Not long ago, the Pistons were the league's punchline: young, chaotic, defensively undisciplined. Now they're playing structured basketball built around patience, ball movement, and interior dominance. And the center of that transformation is Cade Cunningham. Cunningham isn't just scoring, he's orchestrating the entire offensive ecosystem. Nearly 10 assists per game, consistent half-court creation, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to slow the game down when things get chaotic. That matters because Detroit's biggest weakness earlier in the rebuild was tempo control. When defenses pressured them, they rushed possessions. Now they manipulate pace. And that's where this game becomes interesting, because Brooklyn's biggest defensive vulnerability is exactly that: tempo discipline. Look at the Nets' recent stretch. They've dropped multiple games in a row, including a blowout loss to Boston and a continued losing streak that has exposed defensive breakdowns and inconsistent effort. The issue isn't talent alone, it's structure. The Nets have pieces: scorers, athletic wings, rim protectors, but the team lacks a stable offensive hierarchy. When possessions get tight late in games, who controls the offense? That answer changes almost every quarter. Some nights it's Michael Porter Jr. who leads the team in scoring at roughly 24.5 points per game. Other nights, the offense flows through role players or secondary creators. That unpredictability can be dangerous, but more often it becomes chaotic. And chaos is exactly what Detroit's system punishes. Here's where mainstream coverage misses a crucial detail. Detroit's real advantage isn't just talent, it's interior control. Jalen Duren has quietly become one of the most physically dominant young centers in the league, averaging double-digit rebounds and controlling the paint defensively. Against Brooklyn, that matchup becomes critical, because the Nets' interior defense relies heavily on Nick Claxton, an elite shot blocker, yes, but not always the most physical rebounder. If Claxton gets pulled into perimeter switches against Cunningham pick and rolls, Brooklyn's rim protection collapses quickly. And Detroit knows that. Expect Detroit to run high pick and roll actions repeatedly early in the game. Not necessarily to score immediately, but to force Claxton to choose between protecting the rim or stepping out. Once that decision is forced, the Pistons' spacing opens everything else. And this is where coaching becomes a storyline most fans won't notice. Detroit's coaching staff has quietly built one of the league's most disciplined half-court offenses. This team rarely panics late in the shot clock. They reset, they relocate, they hunt mismatches. Compare that to Brooklyn. When the Nets face defensive pressure, possessions often become isolation-heavy. That's a problem against a Detroit defense that thrives on forcing contested jumpers. And the psychological angle here is even more fascinating. Detroit is playing with confidence, but confidence can turn into complacency. Just 2 games ago, they lost a tight contest to Cleveland despite strong performances from their core players. That loss exposed something subtle. Detroit sometimes struggles when opponents slow the game and force them into half-court shot-making rather than transition scoring. If Brooklyn wants any chance in this matchup, that's the blueprint. Slow the game, turn it into a grind, force Detroit to win with jump shooting instead of paint dominance. But there's another layer to this matchup that most analysts are ignoring: front office strategy. Detroit's roster is approaching a financial crossroads. Cunningham's max extension is looming. Young contributors will soon command larger contracts, and management has to decide whether this core is ready for a championship window or whether another major star needs to be added. Games like this influence that decision. If Detroit dominates consistently, the front office may double down on continuity. If weaknesses appear against lower-tier opponents, trade conversations will intensify. And that brings us to Brooklyn. The Nets are entering one of the most complicated roster situations in the league. They're not fully rebuilding, but they're not contending either, which leaves the front office in an awkward middle ground. Do they sell veterans for future picks? Do they chase another star to pair with Porter Jr.? Or do they continue developing a roster that hasn't shown consistent chemistry? Locker room dynamics are already becoming a quiet storyline. When losing streaks stretch, frustration builds. Role players begin questioning minutes. Shot distribution becomes a topic behind closed doors. And that's where this game becomes a psychological test for Brooklyn. Because losing to Detroit is expected, but how they lose matters. If the Nets compete defensively, control tempo, and keep the margin tight, the locker room maintains belief. But if this turns into another blowout, confidence erodes quickly, and fans are already restless. Brooklyn supporters have watched this team struggle through defensive lapses, inconsistent rotations, and unclear long-term direction. Meanwhile, Detroit fans are experiencing something they haven't felt in years: hope, real hope. The Pistons now look like a team that could sustain success, not just a hot streak. But let's challenge the popular narrative for a moment. Is Detroit truly a contender, or are they simply benefiting from a favorable stretch of the schedule? Because the reality is this: Detroit still hasn't consistently beaten the absolute elite teams in the league. Their system works beautifully against weaker defenses, but when opponents apply heavy ball pressure and elite wing defense, the Pistons sometimes stall offensively. That's the weakness Brooklyn must attack. Pressure Cunningham early, force secondary creators to initiate offense, and turn this into a physical defensive battle. If Brooklyn manages that, the game becomes far more competitive than the standings suggest. But if Detroit controls tempo, dominates the paint, and forces the Nets into isolation basketball, this could get ugly quickly. And from a betting perspective, the logic becomes straightforward. Detroit's rebounding advantage, Detroit's home court dominance, Detroit's offensive efficiency, all point toward a Pistons victory. But smart bettors look deeper, because blowouts often hide inside games where motivation disappears. If Detroit jumps to an early double-digit lead, the question becomes whether they maintain intensity or ease off the gas. And that's when underdogs cover spreads. So here's the real prediction: Detroit wins this game. But the scoreline alone won't be the most important takeaway. Watch the pace, watch the pick and roll coverage, watch the body language on the Brooklyn bench if the game starts slipping away. Because what happens in those subtle moments will tell us far more about the future of these franchises than the final scoreboard. And here's the bold truth most analysts won't say out loud: the Pistons are closer to becoming a true Eastern Conference contender than people realize. But the Brooklyn Nets, they're approaching a crossroads where one more losing stretch could force the front office to admit the uncomfortable reality. This roster isn't one move away from contention, it's one major reset away from relevance.